My husband took out a huge life insurance policy on me without telling me. When I found out, I was terrified, but the real twist came when he disappeared and faked his own death instead. I remember it was a humid Thursday morning when the letter arrived. There was nothing special about the day itself. I'd been putting on a pot of coffee, still half asleep, my mind more focused on getting through my lesson plans for the week than on anything remarkable. Nick was out on one of his early starts, which always meant more coffee for me, so I didn't complain. The letter was wedged between a gas bill and a catalog from a local home improvement store. But it wasn't the plain white envelope itself that caught my eye, it was the large red confidential stamped across the front. My name was written in neat, official print on the top, with policyholder information enclosed at the bottom. I don't remember signing up for any new policy. I ripped it open on impulse, thinking maybe it was junk mail or some clever ad campaign. But no. There, in black and white, was confirmation for a life insurance policy under my name, with a sizable payout. And Nick was the beneficiary. $500,000? I muttered, staring at the figure as my stomach did a slow roll. For a second, I laughed it off. This had to be some clerical error or Nick just getting overzealous about our future. He'd been in a kick about preparing for things since his friend Mark had passed away, so it was possible he'd just set something up without asking me. Still, a $500,000 policy? And without even a conversation? A conversation was always his excuse for everything, no matter how minor. When Nick came home that evening, he looked off. Not as if he was hiding something but, I don't know, like he'd had a rough day. I almost didn't bring it up. Almost. I waited until after dinner, where he was predictably planted in front of the TV, a beer in hand. I cleared my throat, standing in the doorway to the living room. Nick, I started, voice deliberately calm, I got a letter from Connecticut Mutual today. He barely looked away from the screen. Oh yeah? Junk mail or something? No, I said, a little sharper than I'd planned. It's a confirmation for a life insurance policy. One I didn't sign up for. There was a brief pause, and I saw him tighten his grip on the beer. He kept his eyes glued to the game. Oh, that. Yeah. I did that for us. For us? I repeated. Without telling me? He glanced over, doing this little dismissive shrug. Babe, it's just insurance. For the future. God forbid, something happens, I want to make sure I'm not, left with nothing. It was a weak attempt at reassuring me, and I knew he knew it. Nick had always been a bit of a talker, but he knew me well enough to know that secrecy wasn't something I tolerated. Not in our marriage. $500,000, Nick? I pressed. That seems a bit excessive. And honestly, the fact that you didn't mention it kind of bothers me. He let out a long sigh, finally muting the TV. Laura, you've always been the worrywart in the relationship, okay? You stress out if I go for a new credit card without consulting you, so yeah, I didn't mention it. Figured it'd be easier this way. But it's my life you're insuring, I said, softer this time, yet somehow that made it worse. That's a big decision to make alone. Nick's face softened as he rubbed a hand over his face, a mixture of irritation and faux patience. Look, if it bothers you that much, I'll cancel it. Happy? I didn't say anything. He knew how to spin it so I'd look unreasonable if I kept pushing. The conversation was left unfinished, but the tension remained. I didn't cancel the policy, I told myself I'd let it go. Maybe he was right, maybe I was overthinking things. But from that moment on, little things started nagging at me. One day, a couple of weeks later, I came home early from school. I'd left my phone at home that day and wanted to grab it during lunch. Nick's car was still in the driveway, which surprised me since he'd mentioned he had back-to-back meetings all day. When I walked in, I heard him talking. The tone was low, almost urgent, and I realized he was on the phone. I froze, instinctively pulling back just out of sight. No, listen, he was saying. I'm telling you, I've got it handled. Just trust me, all right? Everything's going to go smoothly. No one's onto anything. Not even her. I felt like someone had plunged a knife into my stomach. Was he talking about me? And why did it sound so sinister? My foot must have scraped the floor because he suddenly went silent, followed by a sharp, gotta go. When he turned and saw me standing there, his face did a strange half cringe. Hey, Han, he said, trying to sound casual, but the way his voice tightened gave him away. You're home early. Left my phone, I said slowly, watching him. Who was that on the phone? He shrugged, though I saw a flicker of panic before his mask dropped back into place. Just some work stuff, babe. Nothing important. But everything felt off after that. Every time he was on the phone, I found myself eavesdropping, my gut telling me that something was very, very wrong. And then, one Sunday morning, things went from strange to downright terrifying. Nick told me he was going fishing at Lake Hickory with a couple of his work buddies. He left the house at the crack of dawn, like usual. But hours passed, and when I went to call him, his phone went straight to voicemail. Evening came, and still, nothing. I was starting to panic when the call finally came in. A man's voice, gruff, almost bored. "Is this Laura Weston?" "Yes, this is she," I replied, heart hammering in my chest. "Ma'am," he continued, "this is Officer Daniels from Burke County. I'm afraid I have some bad news." The next few minutes were a blur. Car accident. Dead on impact. Local highway. I was numb. The reality of what he'd said didn't fully hit me until hours later, after I'd contacted his family, the few friends we had. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my phone, stunned. Dead. Nick was dead. But there was a creeping feeling beneath the shock, something that whispered to me from that dark part of my mind that I tried to ignore. It didn't make sense. None of this did. The life insurance policy, the secrecy, the vague conversations. Something felt planned. 2 days later, I went to identify the body. When I saw the man on the cold metal slab, my heart lurched. The face was too damaged to recognize, but something about the build. It was Nick's height, his frame. Yet, I felt nothing familiar. It was as if a stranger lay before me. I signed the papers, but an idea started to grow in the back of my mind, slowly, painfully, yet undeniably. A week later, I decided I had to know more. I needed to understand the full picture of Nick's life in those last few months. I hired a private investigator named Rick Steele. He was gruff, no nonsense, and had the kind of presence that put people on edge. 2 weeks later, Rick sat across from me, his expression serious. "Laura, what I'm about to tell you isn't going to be easy. Just tell me," I whispered, gripping the edge of the table. "Nick's alive. He faked his death." I felt like I'd been hit by a train. "What? How? How is that even possible?" He laid out the evidence, showing me bank transactions, surveillance photos of a man who looked suspiciously like Nick, alive and well. Nick had staged everything. The accident, the policy, even the alleged friends who'd apparently been in on it. "I need to see him," I managed, the rage and betrayal boiling in my chest. Rick nodded. "I can get you there." The confrontation happened at a cabin, a remote place in Tennessee where he'd been hiding out. When I saw him, alive, breathing, I almost couldn't breathe myself. He was startled, his face a mix of anger and guilt. "You're alive," I said, the words barely making it past my lips. He tried to defend himself, to talk about freedom and money and lies that didn't make sense. But I didn't want his excuses. "You tried to make me believe you were dead. You took out a policy on me. You put me through hell." My voice broke, tears mixing with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. There was no redemption for him, no forgiveness that I could offer. The betrayal was too deep, the cruelty too raw. The last words I said to him as I left that cabin were, "I loved you, Nick. But the man I loved never existed, did he?" I reported him, made sure the authorities knew every detail. He'd be found eventually. When I went back to my life, it was different. There was a coldness, a sense of loss that would never quite leave me. But in a strange way, I also felt stronger. I knew who I was now. I'd faced the darkest truth of my life and come out the other side, scarred, but unbroken. The days after I left Nick's hideout felt surreal. I had done the unthinkable, faced him, alive and breathing after he'd made me believe he was dead. He thought he was clever enough to fake his own death and disappear, leaving me with the devastation and debt that came with his betrayal. But I wasn't the woman he thought I was, he was about to learn that. Rick Steele, my private investigator, turned out to be more than just a hired hand. He was now invested in making sure justice was served. When I told him what I wanted to do, he was on board immediately. He said it was the least he could do, after seeing the mess Nick had left me in. The plan we devised wasn't simple, but it was thorough. We were going to make Nick pay, not just for the lies and the scheme, but for every time he'd made me feel small, dismissed my fears, and pushed me into a corner. If he wanted to play dirty, he'd learn that I could play too. Nick was lying low, but not low enough. The man couldn't resist checking his bank accounts, or touching base with his new identity. I had Rick plant a few key breadcrumbs, small traps that would lead Nick right into the lion's den, while giving me enough time to finalize my revenge. First, I filed for divorce in absentia, declaring Nick officially deceased. Legally, I was now a widow. And as his widow, I had complete control over every one of his assets and accounts that weren't already drained or hidden. Rick worked his connections, and we managed to track down the remaining stash. Nick had left enough money in our joint accounts for a rainy day, and I moved that money into a separate account, one that only I could access. But this was just the start. With Rick's help, I quietly got the evidence of Nick's fraud into the hands of authorities and several insurance investigators. I wasn't content with him just being caught, I wanted him exposed, humiliated, for everyone to see what he was. I wanted every insurance agency, every bank, every friend, and every family member to know who Nick Weston truly was, a fraud, a coward, a man willing to put his wife through unspeakable pain for his own gain. Finally, Rick set up a sting. Nick, apparently emboldened by the fact he hadn't been caught yet, Had recently started using his fake identity to set up a new insurance policy in Georgia, under a new name. We had our people track him and pinpoint the exact moment he'd be at the insurance office to finalize the new paperwork. The timing was perfect, every law enforcement agency that Rick had contacted was ready to pounce. I remember standing across the street that day, watching from a coffee shop window as Nick walked into that office, dressed in clothes I didn't recognize, wearing his hair a little differently, trying his best to look like someone else. But I would recognize that walk anywhere. He was so close to his goal, he thought he'd gotten away with everything. But not this time. Moments later, police officers swarmed the building. I watched as they pushed him against the wall and cuffed him. His face went from arrogant to terrified in a split second, his eyes darting around the street, trying to figure out who'd set him up. When he spotted me across the street, his face paled. Our eyes locked, and in that brief moment, he knew. He knew I was the one who had done this to him. The trial that followed was a spectacle. Nick tried every excuse in the book, even tried to act like he'd been forced into his plans, but the evidence was airtight. Insurance fraud, identity theft, faking his own death, all of it laid out meticulously in court. I had taken the stand, recounting the nightmare he'd put me through. I watched his face as I described how he'd tried to ruin me, how he'd tried to leave me with nothing. The final nail in the coffin was when his so-called friends, the ones he'd roped into the plan to fake his death, turned on him. They testified against him, revealing how he'd promised them cuts of the insurance money in exchange for their silence. The judge didn't take kindly to the lies, the manipulation, or the total lack of remorse. Nick was sentenced to 20 years in prison without parole. Watching him get taken away in handcuffs, a shadow of the man he once pretended to be, was the closure I needed. In those last moments, he didn't look at me. He didn't shout or try to make some grand apology. He just slumped his shoulders, eyes downcast, resigned to his fate. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life. I left Hickory and moved to Asheville, where I found a small but beautiful apartment. I got a new teaching job and started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping others who had been deceived and abused by the people they trusted most. It felt like a second chance, a new chapter where I could finally put Nick, and the woman I'd been with him, behind me. One evening, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the prison, written in Nick's handwriting. I debated whether to read it but eventually opened it. It was a pitiful attempt at an apology, blaming everyone but himself for what had happened. He asked me to forgive him, to remember the good times. I tossed it in the fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken until there was nothing left. Because that's exactly what Nick Weston was to me now, nothing. As the flames consumed his last words, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. I'd survived his lies, his deceit, his betrayal, and I'd come out stronger. I wasn't the same woman who had trusted him blindly, who'd ignored her instincts for the sake of peace. I was free. Free to live a life that was truly mine. The last flicker of that letter died out, and with it, the last hold Nick had over me. I took a deep breath, looked around my cozy new home, and smiled. The nightmare was over. And I was finally awake.